everybody.
Go ahead.
I think you kind of know how I operate.
Hello.
Oh, thank you. My name is Robtel, Neajai, Pailey. I am an assistant professor based in the Department of Social Policy, and I'm really excited about this this year's departmental seminar series, which I am co-chairing with my colleague Thomas Viegas. He won't be here for this particular term, but he will get to join us in winter term. And for autumn term, what we're doing is we're trying to feature the work of critical scholars of color who are doing really important cutting edge research on parts of the so-called global South. And I'm particularly excited to welcome Lama Tawakkol from the University of Manchester. Lama is an Egyptian scholar who is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Manchester. She also, her research explores capitalism and the global political economy with particular focus on the power and politics of development aid, the social inequalities it produces, and its impacts on states and marginalized populations, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, that's not a region that we tend to focus on sufficiently in the Department of Social Policy. So when I met Lama at the University of Manchester in April, I was very, very happy to have met her, and then even more excited that she agreed to honor this invitation. Now, that's the official bio. What you don't know about Lama, and that's not in her bio, is that she attended the American University in Cairo. And in Liberia, where I'm from, we often say that there are no 6 degrees of separation. There's usually -1 degree of separation. We found out recently that although there wasn't much overlap, Lama studied at AUC, and I was actually an intern at the American University in Cairo a few years before she started. So that's our -1 degree of separation, as it were. But without much ado, I'm going to give Lama an invitation to delve into her topic, which is Imperial Development ? The Humanitarian-Development Nexus in Jordan and Lebanon. Let's give a warm social policy welcome to Lama Tawakkol.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. Thank you for the invitation and a very generous introduction. I'll try to not disappoint after that. And thank you all for being here and taking the time to actually listen to what I have to say. So my presentation today is based on my PhD dissertation not too long ago. I'm currently working on rethinking it and turning it into a book project, so I would be particularly grateful for any comments, questions, or feedback that can help with that. I actually forgot that I put a question mark in the abstract I sent you, and it tells you a little bit about my current thought process. Is it okay to start? So briefly, before we start, I'll just give you a very brief overview of how I will structure the talk. I'll start by giving you an overview of what it is that I'm talking about. So what is the Humanitarian-Development Nexus, followed by the key questions and arguments underlying my talk today and the broader project. I will then give you a bit of theory, not too much. I've tried to significantly make the theory not overwhelm the presentation so that it's more engaging, and then the analysis itself. Last thoughts will be short or long, depending on how much I actually take. So, what is the Humanitarian-Development Nexus? So the Syrian conflict, which erupted in 2011 as uprisings and then quickly became a conflict in 2012, resulted in the world's largest refugee population since the Second World War. Now, as you might assume, neighboring countries of Syria bore the brunt of that crisis. So they took in the most amount of refugees. In fact, the 2 cases that I focus on, Jordan and Lebanon, quickly became the world's highest proportionate recipients of refugees, among the highest, if not the highest, actually. Because obviously the Syrian refugee population came on top of previous refugee populations, so that in Lebanon, for example, 1 of 5 people is a refugee. It's huge numbers, if you think about it. Now, with that sort of surge in their populations, their already strained public resources, infrastructures, everything became even further strained. the global community and global donors quickly started to talk about wanting to support them. In one instance, the World Bank referred to the global public service that they were doing for the rest of the world, and this is why it was everybody's duty to help them. And this is how the HDN, or the Humanitarian-Development Nexus, was born. So the Humanitarian-Development Nexus is presented by donors as an innovative paradigm in how we deal with global forced displacement. So in lieu of the humanitarian responses that had prevailed since then, by humanitarian responses, we mean emergency responses on the spot, usually operating in parallel to the state, so nothing sort of long-term. They proposed coming in with more development solutions to the crisis. So they said humanitarian solutions are no longer working, they're not sustainable. The Syrian conflict is becoming protracted. This is UN language for saying that it's lasted longer than 5 years. These refugees are essentially not leaving anytime soon, and we need to deal with this more sustainably. That means development solutions, which typically focus on state resources, state institutions, state services, and work with the state rather than around it. Now, what this means is that the HDN was presented as a way to capitalize on the crisis. So the Syrian refugee influx into both countries was a challenge, yes, but donors would also have us think that it was an opportunity to take advantage of the situation and actually help these host countries with their infrastructure and public services, thereby helping not only refugees, but also host communities and marginalized populations therein. Even though it emerged within the Syrian context in these two countries, the HDN has now become institutionalized in global documents, in the works of donors, UN institutions, the OECD, bilateral and multilateral donors, essentially everyone. The Global Compact on Refugees by the UN is one very clear example of this. So this is just to kind of highlight how many Syrian refugees, this is, I think, also a very sort of conservative estimate. Both host countries say that they've taken in a lot more refugees than this. So again, huge crisis, this is how we tackle it, according to donors. So before we go into this, I'll just lead up to it. So why the HDN, or what about the HDN in particular that I find so interesting? Of course, interesting is subjective. After a few years, I'm not so sure, but so the thing is, the HDN, when you look at it more closely, it's the solutions that it offers are not really new. They follow the same market-based development solutions that donors have pushed for in these countries for decades. And the support, the financial or technical support to both countries and the aid relations between them and donors are not new either. So it's just sort of, at the face of it at least, repackaging things in a new way. So this is particularly relevant if we look at the histories of these countries, where there have been a lot of crises over time, starting with Palestinian refugee waves in 1948 and 1967. In the case of Lebanon, the civil war, the reconstruction after, and then the 2006 war with Israel. So there have been a lot of cases where donors have said this is a crisis in both countries and we need to support them. In other words, I thought that the HDN as a link in these aid relations, as the latest iteration of these aid relations, might be interesting to look at as a reflection of these aid relations, and more specifically, capitalist relations in the region. What can it tell us about that? Even though the HDN is very timely in terms of policy, scholarship around it is emerging, but hasn't been wide enough, in my opinion. Very briefly, it is also either exclusively policy oriented, so focused on the potentials of this paradigm, how can we improve it, how can policymakers sort of make use of it, or it's been critical of the HDN in responses to the Syrian refugee influx, but within sort of the mindset of geopolitical aims and how host states are rent-seeking through these responses, etc. And the few scholarships that have placed it within the context of the global economy or global capitalism have done so, but with sort of a focus on specific elements. So for instance, the emphasis on livelihoods or the EU Jordan Compact or things like that. To my knowledge, no one has really looked at the HDN from a broader picture as a more as a wider sort of framework and shift in donors' strategies and discourses. So in order to do so, I focus on these two countries, particularly the work of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the EBRD, in Jordan, and the World Bank in Lebanon, with a focus on both countries' water sectors. So before the refugee influx, both countries had significant water problems, whether in relation to quality or quantity or both. And as such, donors have really emphasized the fact that their water infrastructure and water sectors have been further sort of pressured in light of the crisis and really focused their efforts on that. I draw on the interviews I did during my fieldwork in both countries between June 2019 and December 2020, as well as content analysis of things ranging from national strategy documents to donor project documents and frameworks, and civil society reports. The key questions guiding my research are as follows. Broadly, what are the politics and power relations underlying this shift to the HDN? So what's kind of motivated it? What are the hidden relations that we can explore? How does the involvement of new actors like development banks through this HDN, actors who hadn't been involved in refugee responses before, what does that mean for the response and for the sectors in which responses are provided, such as the water sectors in these cases? And finally, who primarily benefits from this and who's at the shorter end of, who has the shorter end of the stick? I argue, or I will try to argue throughout this talk, that the HDN is an expression of how development aid and projects serve to extend and deepen imperial relations within the region. And I will come back in a little bit to really explain what I mean by that. More specifically, through the HDN's focus on development solutions, it promotes private accumulation in the public sector. It reinforces neoliberal logics and solutions within these sectors. And in doing so, it advances the material and political interests of donors as well as host states and private businesses at the expense of refugees and other marginalized communities who are, in fact, I argue, worse off. And I will talk about this in a little bit. Now, that said, I also argue that this happens across multiple scales rather than in a sort of traditional top-down understanding. So host states are as much involved in this, for example, as these donors are. Now, some terms to keep in mind, and I'll try to keep this non-jargony and short. So, as I kind of implied, the framework guiding this analysis is a Marxist political economy framework and a historical materialist method. So basically, through historical materialism, I highlight how these cases, how the HDN in this case is situated within global capitalism and serves to reproduce these imperial relations. Which brings me to my first term. So when I talk about imperialism, I'm referring to, or I'm understanding it as a relation of exploitation and dependence that subordinates these recipient states to global capitalist accumulation. So in other words, these projects, these HDN projects, don't only reproduce capitalist interests, so they don't only promote profit, for example, but they also keep these states, I don't want to say locked in because that implies a static thing, but they keep these states constantly dependent on these flows and also benefiting from these flows. So it's actually in these states' interests to maintain this cycle of dependence, but it means that they are constantly reproducing these capitalist interests to the benefit of these actors rather than their own populations. The second term, and sorry, the emphasis on imperial relations here is very significant and is on purpose and intentional, again, because it implies this active role on the part of not only host states, but also social movements and local movements, which I will come to in the Lebanon case towards the end of the presentation. So again, when I talk about imperialism, this is not to imply that this is something that's already there, complete, top down, we don't really have anything to do about it, but rather that these are relations that are constantly being made and remade by various actors, and that it's not just these donors that are the focus of them. The second thing that is of interest is neoliberalism or neoliberalization, again, to imply this constant movement. Very briefly, neoliberalization is finance-led capitalism since the 1970s. It emphasizes social spending cuts, privatization, a bigger role for the private sector, austerity, etc. Within the context of the Middle East, neoliberalization is very important because it's been part of donors' strategies since the beginning of the 1990s with structural adjustment programs. Other scholars, notably Adam Hanea at Essex, have noted how structural adjustment programs and neoliberalism is a fundamental feature of imperialism in the region, and how the region is subordinated to global capitalist interests. The last point is what I call commodified survival. So basically, as I will show, what happens with the HDN is that things are commercialized, they're transformed into things like water are transformed into commodities that are available for money, which means that refugees do not have the same access to them, they're not guaranteed, basically, which makes the survival of marginalized populations like refugees much harder and much more transactional, basically. And this is what I refer to as commodified survival, where survival becomes based on these commodities and transactional exchanges. So what is actually happening? So more of the empirical stuff. The first point that kind of encapsulates the rest of the argument is that despite what its name might suggest, the Humanitarian-Development Nexus is actually fundamentally a development-based approach. So if you really look at it, it's development with nothing else really, just humanitarian in the name. And it serves to bring in key development actors like development banks, who again, were not part of these responses before, and makes them sort of the leading actors in outlining these responses and what it means to respond to refugee influxes and the pressures of them. In other words, the answer to the refugee influx and the pressures of these host states is development. So host states will develop, things will be good for their host communities, for refugees will stay there, they will not make the trip to Europe, everything will be good. That's essentially the logic. We see this in various frameworks. So I have some quotes on here, but these are not the only ones. So for instance, both donors and host states emphasize the developmental fallouts of the refugee influx to both countries at various points. So for example, in the Jordan response plan, which is Jordan's own refugee response plan, there are multiple references to how the influx has impacted Jordan and Jordanian services on the ground. The same goes to Lebanon, but given Lebanon's development priorities, there's much more emphasis on infrastructure, for example. King Abdullah of Jordan, on at least one occasion, speaking to the international community, called on the international community to help Jordan in bearing this crisis. So basically they say, Jordan's happy to do this, but you need to help us out. What are you going to give us? Because we're doing this, again, public service to the rest of the world. It's clear in the UN's Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan, commonly referred to as the 3RP, which is the regional response to the crisis, which also in 2015 started to emphasize this developmental aspect to it. And it's evident in the kind of support that's provided to countries through the HDN. So shortly after the crisis, I think in 2015, yes, in September 2015, the World Bank, the UN, and the Islamic Development Bank jointly introduced what they called the new financing initiative to support the Middle East and North Africa. This soon became what they call the Global Concessional Finance Facility, which basically is just another outlet to provide more loans to these countries under the auspices of the refugee crisis. So it's just basically more loans to develop, more loans to implement these massive infrastructure projects. The EU explicitly refers again to the development opportunities posed by the crisis. And this becomes even more evident once the HDN became institutionalized at the global level in following years. So it becomes evident in the documents by the OECD, in the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, and the Global Compact on Refugees, and other very similar documents. Now, this development-based approach has a lot of ramifications, or means a lot of things for what this response means on the ground. So I kind of try to make sense of these by grouping them into three main points. The focus on infrastructure, the introduction of new financing mechanisms such as blended finance, and I'll briefly explain what that is in a minute, and the passage of institutional reforms that are overwhelmingly neoliberal in nature, either in sectors that weren't previously neoliberalized, or just to sort of entrench this neoliberal thinking within them. As we talk about infrastructure, this is a picture of one of the water infrastructure projects of the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development in Jordan. Now, why is the focus on infrastructure not necessarily a good thing, I'm arguing? For multiple reasons. It's not the focus on infrastructure that's necessarily bad, but it's how this is translated, what the solutions offered are. And these are overwhelmingly to fund through loans these massive infrastructure projects, and also to bring in even more investors and private actors, either through the funding of these projects or their future implementation. And now, the focus on infrastructure is very clear. So for instance, 74% of the EBRD's refugee response plan project portfolio in Jordan targets sustainable infrastructure. Similarly, in Lebanon, both the government's documents as well as the recommendations of donors, such as the World Bank, emphasize infrastructure, the impact on infrastructure, and the need for infrastructure. Sorry, I lost it. Now, again, what happens with these projects? So, as I mentioned earlier, they provide entry points, further entry points for private investors in the private sector within these ostensibly public initiatives. And this is not even sort of under the table. This is a very clear aim by everybody involved. But other than the investors, it is also a very clear profit-making accumulation opportunity for global capitalists. So just as a brief example, the West Irbid wastewater project, which is the project I focus on in Jordan by the EBRD, its feasibility study and environmental and social due diligence assessment, which cost around 146,000 euros, was implemented or done by Mott MacDonald, which is a global British consultant, for instance. At the same time, the World Bank's Bisri Dam project in Lebanon, the dam was eventually cancelled, but we'll come to that towards the end. But when it was a project, the contracting and supervision was handed over to major Turkish contractors, for example. But it was also an opportunity for local businesses affiliated with local politicians and ruling parties in Lebanon to profit through them. I won't bore you with like the nitty-gritty details, but that is just an overall picture. The focus on infrastructure also serves key legitimacy interests. So it's not just about their material gain, but for example, in Jordan, projects like these allow local politicians and donors alike to say, here, we're doing something. This is how we're responding to the refugee influx. We understand that these refugees are placing the burden on your services, that things are becoming more expensive or scarce. So we are actually doing something. At one point, a local politician in Jordan also emphasized that these projects don't just address the water problem, but they also address the unemployment problem, because we're going to be offering all of these job opportunities for all of you. They also allow officials to say things like, which was said to me in an interview, that this is an opportunity to bring in the EBRD and make use of the latest European standards. And like, this is a very good thing, because these are the standards, of course, right? How are these projects financed? How are these projects financed? This is where blended finance comes in. So a broader development agendas call for new methods of financing to fill the so-called humanitarian financing gap. So the idea is that humanitarian needs far surpass the funds that are available. So we need, guess who? The private sector to come in and help us, because they have all of these resources and all of this expertise that we have to sort of use, right? So blended financing basically refers to that. So it's the idea that you take grants, for example, and you mix them, you blend them with non-grant components, including private financing, in order to fund whatever it is that you're trying to fund. One key example of this is the use of public-private partnerships, for example, or PPPs. And blended financing is very, very clear as a key component of the HDN. So, for instance, again, the West Nurbid wastewater project in Jordan by the EBRD is a PPP, actually. And it presents this as a model to follow. It is the way to go, and it's one of many PPPs in the pipeline. In Lebanon, even though there are less PPPs, both donors and officials alike emphasize the need to bring the private sector in and incentivize it. So yes, we know that the Lebanese environment in the public sector isn't really appealing, that people wouldn't want to invest. So what can we do in the immediate term to make it worth investing in as soon as possible, essentially? So one government official in Lebanon explicitly says, we, the ministry, cannot implement infrastructure projects if the private sector does not intervene. Without the private sector, we can do nothing. So this is the idea, even though we haven't been able to incentivize the private sector enough in Lebanon, we need to do what we can for that. So it sounds like this should be good, right? We don't have the funds, the private sector is providing it. Why is this really a bad thing? PPPs might boost and incentivize private investment in the public sector, but that also means that these public sectors become more attuned to making the investments worth it, rather than fulfilling the public interests that they are meant to fulfill. So we will see this in a little bit in what it means in the water sector, but for example, it becomes about increasing tariffs to cover costs rather than ensuring that everybody gets water. It also, PPPs actually bring in little revenue. So they rely so much on state spending, and these are states that are increasingly being locked into more debt and encouraged to decrease their social spending. So they're spending on these large PPP projects, which are increasingly motivated by investments and profit and things like that, and also decreasing their spending elsewhere. Okay. Another thing is that other than PPPs, these new financing mechanisms or blended financing entrench debt relations. So this is where kind of the imperialism can come back in. It's there all along, but just very clearly. It reproduces these historical debt relations, and in some cases, such as Lebanon, for example, where historically the public debt has been held mostly by the domestic banking sector, it brings in new creditors, such as the World Bank. So the Bisti Dam project, before it was cancelled, was the largest World Bank loan to Lebanon to date, for example. And it reproduces, even though host states actually benefit from these loans, it reproduces their dependence on it, right? Again, if these states are constantly pushed to decrease their social spending, but they are increasingly taking out loan after loan after loan, they're going to focus more on servicing these loans and paying them back rather than anything else. So the state priorities shift, or maybe they don't shift, maybe they were always not there, but they're definitely not as much focused on public interest as they should be, in my opinion. And this loan sort of debt motif is very present in the HDN. So if we look at the numbers, this is between 2016 and 2020, there was $11.3 billion pledged for humanitarian financing for these two countries. So this is the sort of grant, no strings attached humanitarian funds, versus $40.8 billion pledged by development banks and loans. That's more than double, right? So more than triple, actually. So again, it's the priorities are shifting, right? With HDN, we see an emphasis on development, and it's a very specific understanding of development. This becomes even clearer when we look at the institutional reforms that are pushed for in these projects. Both projects, the Bisti Dam and the West Irbid Wastewater Project, emphasize, again, financial sustainability and governance. What does that mean? It means that these water sectors, these public water sectors, need to prioritize being financially sustainable. They need to prioritize their accounting sheets, basically, and balances and things like that over whether or not people are getting access to water. Now, when you look at that from a very business perspective, what it means is that they have to increase their tariffs because they're not making revenue. They have to suspend, for example, people's water if people don't pay anymore. They have to make sure that people are paying. It becomes, again, a transaction. They're providing a commodity, and they need their money in order to be able to provide that. One Lebanese ministry official rationalized this to me and put it in very sort of blunt terms. Okay, sure, water is a gift from God, but the services to provide the water from the source to your house is not a gift from God. So this thing happens through someone who delivers this service, and you need to pay for the supply networks. These are the type of logics, these are the type of neoliberal logics, I might add, that are very much pervasive at both levels with donors and in these states, and which are reproduced and institutionalized through these projects. Now, if we come back to the idea of imperialism as relational rather than unidirectional, let's focus a little bit on the role of these states in playing this out. So this is a very nice picture of Jordanian and EBRD officials signing something, I'm not sure what. But it's very indicative of the quite positive relationship between them. Where, for instance, the Jordanian state has actually implemented the necessary legislation to make these projects viable. So in 2014 and then later in 2020, it introduced PPP legislation that makes it so much easier to implement PPPs in public sectors. In 2020, the amendments to the law were actually to explicitly allow PPPs in sectors such as energy and water, where previously the idea of having private actors involved was not quite on the table. It has also implemented PPP, what's it called? Development facility or something like that. I forget what exactly it's called, but it's basically to create a pipeline of PPPs and ensure that business actors are incentivized to invest in these projects. And ironically, even though this is supposed to be for the public sector, these projects are now within this facility out of the democratic domain. So they're signed off, it's a very technocratic process, they're signed off and agreed without anybody getting any input on them. On a more hopeful note. The idea that imperialism or imperial relations in this case are relations could also be a positive thing. So in Lebanon, the Bisri Dam project that I've been referring to so far invoked a lot of public resistance and contestation for, I think, around 2 years in 2018 until 2020. Huge public demonstrations, sit-ins at the site, led by the Save Bisri Valley campaign. The idea was that this was against heritage, environmental concerns, local populations, everything. And they petitioned to the World Bank, they sent for an inspection. The World Bank came to inspect twice and said, no, everything is fine. Both the Lebanese government and World Bank officials were completely clear on this project having been sort of scrutinized and studied, and this is the best project, and we've taken all the mitigation measures. These people, the protesters, the activists, they don't want to listen, they just want to resist and sort of object, and that's it. This was actually told to me in several interviews in early 2020 about that. But ultimately, so very briefly, the activists used a variety of techniques. So in addition to the protests and sit-ins and things like that, they also wrote to key parties, so the Green Movement in Germany, for instance, who are key stakeholders in the World Bank, and told them, try to stop this project. They left nothing to be done, to be honest. And very impressively for me, the project actually got cancelled. So in 2020, in September 2020, the World Bank suspended the project. Now, of course, they don't say that they suspended the project because of resistance. It's a very technical reason about something that the government was supposed to do that they couldn't do. I think they needed to regain access to the site, which the protesters had under control and the government couldn't. So they needed to suspend the project. But I think following it closely, we can see that they at least had a little bit of influence over it, even if it really is about not gaining access to the site. The fact that they could do that brings me back to the point that these relations, even though there are fundamental power imbalances involved, do not necessarily mean that these big bad capitalists will always win, right? It means that there is always, because they are relations, there is always that opportunity, that space to negotiate these relations. Arguably, if activists or movements are strong enough in their own sort of geographic regions and are able to exercise some influence over the state, they would have even a bigger say, because the states, as we saw, had a very crucial say in how these relations were negotiated. So if the states were not negotiating to the material and political gain of their ruling classes, in most of these cases, the result could have also been different. Now, this brings me to the sort of final part of my argument on the beneficiaries themselves. How am I doing on time?
Continue. I'll give you another 10 minutes.
What does this mean for the refugees? Basically, commodified survival. So if my project focuses on water, but I bet that this applies to other public services as well. If these public services, basically basic needs, right? It's not just a service, we all need water, right? When these become increasingly governed along market-based lines, when they become commodities for additional fees on top of everything else that refugees are required and struggling to pay, then they're actually worse off. The HDN doesn't even make it the same, but makes them worse off. Now, my fieldwork was cut short because of COVID, and things were a bit unstable globally at the time. So I didn't speak to a lot of refugees. This is the sort of desk research, and it wasn't the main focus of the project, but even just looking at the surface of things, if, according to World Bank estimates, around 88% of refugees in Jordan and Lebanon are either already poor or likely to be poor, and cash assistance to them, which has also been decreasing since 2015 with the advent of the HDN, has never covered more than 60 or 70% of their needs, and I think that's actually a generous estimate, then what does the sudden increase in the costs of these things do? Right, if now they have to pay for water as well. And mind you, the HDN, the development-based approach, means again that humanitarian assistance is shrinking. The logic is that these refugees are now the responsibility of their host states, right? We are developing these public services so that they're available to everyone, including refugees, which means that their survival is now the host state's responsibility, or even increasingly their own individual responsibility. So things are getting worse, and whatever they had before is shrinking. So I argue that they emerge as the primary and very clear losers of the HDN, despite they being the purported beneficiaries of this, right? While the key beneficiaries, to sort of answer my last question, are donors, private sector actors across the board. So we have investors, we have global capitalists, large corporations, but also local capitalists in the ruling classes and beyond. And host states as host states, because they can then sort of push for their own development priorities and say, hey, we're doing something. So what now? My story ends in 2020, because that's when my field work ended, basically. But it doesn't necessarily end here. So if, as I argue, this is a story of power-hungry capitalism, imperialism, because it's a cycle that constantly locks these countries in it, it's a story of also potentially resistance and contestation. And like I said, it doesn't end here. So the interests and the relations embodied in the HDN can actually be seen in other things so far. Now, I haven't looked at these things closely, but just by skimming through them, I can see so many of the same themes. So in August 2020, Lebanon suffered a major blast explosion in its port. And then it was also very hard hit by COVID. So the World Bank introduced the 3RF, Lebanon Reform, Recovery, and Reconstruction Framework, which just by literally skimming through includes so many of the same major themes and focuses: infrastructure, institutional reforms, etc. The same can be said if we look at the COVID recovery loans and plans across the region, I think even globally. So again, here, infrastructure is the way to build out from the pandemic. And I haven't, again, looked at this closely, but I'm sure that it's presented as innovative and new and groundbreaking. And on the other hand, as things become more complicated for people, so COVID didn't make things easier, the Ukraine war didn't make the global economy any better for anyone. There are local challenges as well, and all of that. This is my, again, hopeful sort of optimism, is that as things continue to get worse, people will be less likely quelled and silenced and less easily co-opted into this. And maybe we can see more of the Bisri Dam scenario where people are taking control of things. Analytically, this means that even though my analysis is sort of confined to the HDN within the specific cases with Jordan and Lebanon, it could potentially be expanded to other cases within the region and beyond to see how much of these patterns exist, whether they exist, and what that means for development policy and practice. How can we understand, for example, the aid advanced against the backdrop of COVID or climate change or other infrastructure needs? Now, if you follow development policy a little bit, you'll see that infrastructure is this big thing now. What about that? What does that mean? How do non-Western donors play into this. So they're on the rise. They also have their own development agendas. Now, where do they fit within these broader relations and agendas? What does imperialism mean within this context of global intercapitalist rivalry, if we take the terms of this argument seriously? There is also, of course, more room for empirical research on the impact of populations themselves. So what do these policies, so I've sort of looked at the politics and power of these policies, but what do these policies actually mean on the ground? Do they really make things worse off? How are people coping with them? How do they respond to them? What opportunities are there for mobilization and resistance? What would that look like? What can be done in order to regain control of the state and possibly have it advance different interests than the ones that it is doing at the moment? I think that these questions are particularly significant because it's very easy to assume that sort of the for public development paradigm is gone. The financialization of development is here to stay, which it seems to be quite prominent, right? But we also see that this is fraught with contradictions, that this is possibly not sustainable, and we shouldn't take it for granted. So I think this research agenda focusing on this possibility can provide us with a bit of hope, but also maybe strategies. On that kind of hopeful, I hope, note, I will end.